So we're going to be looking at teaching individual routes in and out of the classroom. I suppose this idea of individuality is a kind of dream for everybody. There's this idea that everybody would like, ideally, their one-to-one teacher, their personal trainer. Perhaps not putting us through quite the same painful process as this man, but in able to help us get what we want from the class. So, to meet our direct needs and to move forward in that way. So what I want to do is to kind of look at this a little bit more and look at it both within the classroom and outside of the classroom. So we'll be taking this idea of giving students choice. We'll be looking at tasks and differentiation. One idea of the, lots of people go in for this individualization. One of the driving forces of task-based learning actually is this idea that tasks can kind of self-regulate for different levels or different abilities of students. Then we'll look at some ideas about divergent concept checking. So this is the idea, perhaps you recognize concept checking, perhaps you learned it on a CELTA course or something similar, where we ask questions to check students' understanding of language, but they tend to be a kind of yes, no. And what we'll be looking at are questions which can check understanding, but also have a varied response, which allows for a certain kind of individualizing. And also that idea of personalizing language. And we'll look at this in particular within the idea of vocabulary teaching. Then we'll have a look at looking outside of the classroom, particularly options for home learning, the idea of having positive distractions, and then finally a brief discussion on assessment, and particularly assessment for learning. So one thing, that while we're all after this kind of individualized one-to-one, this is perhaps our ideal, is what's interesting to me is that actually to some degree, firstly, we have to be realistic that for a lot of us, that's simply not possible in terms of the cost of having a personal tutor. And practically, perhaps there aren't simply enough teachers in the world to allow for that to happen. But there's also a factor that, socially, people do like doing things together. So if you take going to the cinema or going to the theatre, playing sport, basically often people go to the cinema to see one film together. They're doing it in a social way. Maybe, the difference between that and a class, and I think there is a kind of drive to go to a classroom for social reasons as much as learning ones. The difference with a cinema is that perhaps the students have chosen, or the people going have chosen the particular film they want to see. Whereas when they go to the class, okay, they've chosen the school, they maybe have a reputation of the teachers, which are good, but they haven't particularly necessarily chosen A, the course book, or B, what's within the course book. So one thing that we might kind of decide is, imagine here we've got a picture of a map of Dublin. We're all visiting it. Within a group, different groups will have different interests, different places they want to visit. Similarly, within one group, even though we might go to the same place, there may be different routes we can take. And essentially what we could do is start by talking to our students about the reasons they are studying in this particular class, the reasons they want English, the topics they're interested in, the subjects they want to be able to do, the tasks they want to be able to do with their English, and to use that as a basis to make some choices within the course that we are using. Now, part of the structure of roadmap is that we do have two kind of routes within the book. So on the one hand, we have the main units, we could describe them here, which are essentially based around speaking and listening. There are short texts, but these texts are sometimes there to really promote the topic, to promote discussion, set the tone of the unit, and also kind of contextualize some of the language that we're teaching. So for a lot of students, when they come to class, really that is their main goal, is to develop their speaking. And so what we're providing is opportunities for them to do that. What you'll notice is within a unit, there may be a kind of vague connecting theme amongst the different lessons, but actually they are also quite different lessons. They're quite different topics. So there's a kind of avoidance of some of this topic fatigue, which we might experience. And I'll come back to that in a moment. However, imagine you are teaching more academic students, perhaps in a university setting or a pre-university setting. Students want to develop their reading skills, their writing skills. So what we have is an extended route where there are particular units on reading, listening, and writing with a particular focus on developing skills. And if anybody saw Damien's talk a couple of weeks ago, which you can also check out on the website, what these units are trying to do are really teach some of these skills and develop them in different ways. So you could stick to the speaking, or we could have an extra focus or a more of a focus on the reading and writing, for example, okay, depending on the focus of your students. Similarly, I don't know if you're ever had this experience yourselves, but when I was teaching in the UK, and now actually we run a kind of summer school, we have quite short courses. So obviously doing a whole course book is not possible. So often what I do is I might use course material, but what I will do is to ask the students to vote. I'll give them the list of topics or the unit content. I'll ask them to choose, say, 2 or 3 favorite things that they want to do. And maybe also say one thing that they definitely don't want to do. Okay, and then I would take in that kind of collection of options, and from that I would work out, which were the most popular units and base the course around that. So I adapt it again, maybe to an even shorter course than the one is offered by the fast track route. What I would say with a roadmap is, because of this kind of changing of topic to some degree within each lesson, that actually you have some options for greater granularity in the way you check that. So you could give them this, a list of all the lesson topics and use those as the basis of your discussion of what the students are more or less interested in. To be honest, I think that's worth doing, even if you're going to do the whole book, just to get a feel for what students' interests are. And what you then might want to do is, when you finish one lesson, if you know the students are particularly interested in that, you then might want to develop your extended route, because within these 2 topics, there is a kind of close link. So what you'll see at the end of, say, the 1C, there will be a kind of go to and read more about this topic, or go to and listen more about this topic, and then you can follow it in that way. So there are options there in the design of the course, where we can give the students choice, limited choice, admittedly, but choice for different types of class Okay, what I want to look at now is to kind of think a bit more in detail about within the class how we can cater for individuals as we are teaching material. Now, one thing we can do is to use tasks themselves. Each of the main units that we saw there, the speaking tasks, work towards a final speaking goal, and they're actually based on originally they're based on a GSE can-do statement. The GSE is essentially took the CFR, Common European Framework, its original kind of research, and tried to extend it and add to some of those can-do statements to kind of build these in-between levels, these B1 and these B1 plus levels, etc. So what you get in the GSE, you will have something like, for example, if we take the first speaking on the left, the GSE goal will be, I think, is the students can use sophisticated language to decide where to or what to do or where to go or something else. I'm sorry, I can't remember the precise one. So you get a general can-do statement, and then we've reduced it to this deciding where to eat, and the language which will helps them to do this. The second one is based on a GSE, which is that students can give a basic presentation connected with something they are familiar with. So here we give them, students are doing an induction on their place of work or where they are studying. So basically introducing a new worker or a new student to the school or the place of work and telling them something about it. Then we have kind of more of a monologue talking about an accident or a mistake they made, and then there's a discussion. So in this case about education. And so what you see is the students are getting a variety of speaking tasks. Now, what's important about these tasks is that they offer a kind of individualizing approach, if you like. How does that happen? How do the tasks differentiate? Well, the first thing is that in doing the tasks, essentially students use the language at their disposal. So yes, we can teach and we do teach them language which may help them do these activities, but fundamentally in doing the activities, the students will use the language which is at their level, essentially what they are capable of. And what the teacher can then do is they pay attention to what the students are doing, and where they see perhaps a breakdown in communication, or perhaps they're using their L1, the teacher can intervene and provide them with language to help them get over that breakdown in communication. You might then take what you've helped those students with and put it on the board and deal with that post task as well. So it's made available to the whole of the class, and I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. I know what I would say is that I know that there are sometimes some training will suggest that when students do so-called fluency tasks, that the teacher should always be on the outside, noting down, not interfering with what the students are saying. I would say personally that I do, where I see the students struggling, where I see them using L1, personally I do help them at that moment to talk. But as I say, either way, there'll be this post-task work. So we're dealing with individuals in that way. There are some further options to working with tasks in this way. One is that you could, rather than leaving the final speaking to the end of the class, what you could do is actually to start with that speaking task. What you will notice, I can't remember if it was on the, oops, sorry, I need to go back. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Yeah, what you'll see here is the prepare stage. So very often there is a little listening or a preparation where students hear a model of the task. So they're not being totally, if you did it as the first task, as a first step, you wouldn't be throwing the students entirely into the deep end with the task. But by doing that, you see exactly where the students are at. So we can intervene, we can do some post-task work, and then we can draw attention to that language, which is then basically within the lesson. You will see a vocabulary and grammar exercises and work, which will help them to do this final task. So basically the students have been primed to think about the vocabulary that they need, primed to think about the grammar that they might need. And then through the course of the lesson, we can then kind of support them with that language. And then what I would ask them to do is to redo the task. Okay, whether you do it as the start or at the end, another way that we can support and differentiate for individuals is that we can ask the students to do the task and record themselves using, for example, a mobile phone. So if they're doing it in pair work, they could still do it in this way. They record it, then together they listen to their recording. You ask them as they're listening to notice problems where they stumbled or where they had difficulty, or to think about ways that they might say it better. They can pause, they can note these down if you like, and then at the end of it you give them an opportunity to ask questions, ask about language to help them do the task better. Okay, so again, it's an individualized task where then we bring these individual ideas together in a plenary session. Similarly, you can, and this works particularly well for these kind of monologues. I don't know about you, when I ask students to prepare sometimes to tell a story, I often ask them to take notes, but what happens is the students either start trying to write the whole thing out, or they simply just start talking with their partner and they don't really prepare at all. So what I sometimes ask them to do is to record them doing the task in their L1, in their own language first. Okay, now there is a kind of extra reason for doing this way round, which is that when we are doing a task, what we're thinking about is both the content and the language to fulfill that content. Students, if we're doing it in L1, what we're doing is kind of separating out these two stages. So first we get them to do it in L1, where usually they'll be better able to think about the content in the first instance. We then get them to listen, think about how they would say it in English. Again, we can ask them to make notes. They can ask them to look at dictionaries, bilingual dictionary, ask you on an individual basis, and then maybe on a plenary basis. And then we ask them to do the task again in English. Even if you you are in a multilingual, well, okay, even if you don't want them to perhaps record, perhaps you don't have access to a mobile phone, one thing you might do is to consider mediation. So in this scenario, what you would do is, say if you're doing a pair work, you would have one student, well, you'd work with the other as pair work or a story, in fact. You'd have one student who's doing it in L1, perhaps the weakest student. We would have one person who's the mediator, ideally a stronger student or the strongest student, and then they basically translate for the weaker student to another student. That other student then will make comments or ask questions, which again the mediator will translate for the first student. So you have this kind of interpreting or mediation, which is becoming a big thing in the CFR now. You know, through that, the stronger student will actually learn perhaps what they're not so good at. Perhaps they will learn things which they don't know. And after they've done this mediation, again, you can have them a moment where they take a bit of time, think about the language that they couldn't translate, think about how they could say it better, ask you, use a dictionary. And then basically what you could do is, you know, the L1, the mediator could explain that new language to the L1 student first, and then in a final draft, if you like, everybody tells their own story in English once again. Okay, so everybody does get it in the end. And this is a kind of important other side to this individual process with tasks, that what we're doing is we're feeding in to individuals from time to time, but then we're getting students to redo the task. And ideally, we might do that at least twice, but possibly even 3 times. If you're worried about what you can do in terms of redoing and worried about students getting bored with this, I mean, basically we can change partners, or you might suggest the students, okay, we did it 5 minutes last time, we had to do this task. This time you're doing exactly the same task, but you're going to do it in 3 minutes. So we can vary the time that the students have. And obviously each time we might also encourage them to try and use some of this language, this new language which emerged through the task taking. Okay, that's tasks and seeing how we can differentiate them. What I would say is just a brief moment here is also to think about how that feedback, that whole class feedback works. So what I've got here are some examples of the type of feedback that I might give. They're each relating to those speaking tasks that we saw. So sometimes, I mean, this is particularly relevant in the UK setting where I am, where students are interested in more colloquial ways of saying things. So here I might ask, I might say, okay, several people were said correctly, what do you want to do? And I might write this on the board. There is actually, we often ask this in a more colloquial way. We use the word fancy. What's the question? Some of the better students might know fancy already and give the answer. What do you fancy doing? Obviously, some of them might know the word fancy, but forget that it's followed by an ing. So what do you fancy do, they might say, or what do you fancy to do? And again, we kind of correct them through that process. The weakest students who are still saying what you want do, or what do you want to do, are still also getting an example of the correct way to say what do you want to do. Okay, a second way, this relates to that one of the induction to the workplace or the students, is what I will do is I will reformulate what the students were trying to say. So you can imagine the students in this sentence actually may have said, the alarm is try every day at 9 o'clock. So if you hear it a different time, you must leave right now. Okay, so that might be what they say. What I do is to reformulate that into a kind of better English, if you like, and I draw attention to the words or structures by gapping the sentence. Okay, so in this case, I might say, yeah, so this student was talking about the fire alarm and what they do with it. And they said the alarms, they try it every day at 9. It's a different word though. The alarms, and then I elicit the word test and then test it. Okay, because obviously it's also checking grammar. With the grammar words themselves, I might just simply say, what's the missing word? Maybe here I might say, you know, it means different. Here we just, if the students know, if they don't know it, this is a sign that, you know, some students may be ready to learn as quickly as, that kind of pattern of comparative. Another way I might do it is to give the sentence. So again, the student may have said something like, oh, it was very stupid that I lose my passport. And I would say, yeah. So I heard this, somebody was saying they did a really stupid mistake. And we often say it in this way, somehow I managed to. I know managed is often success, but we often use it to talk about terrible failures. So somehow I managed to lose my passport. Somehow I managed to get lost on the way here. Somehow I managed to, and then I would elicit other possibilities from the individual students within the classroom. Okay, and then the final one, this is the one from the education speaking. I might again give them a phrase. In fact, this is a kind of based on the grammar and language which we taught in that lesson. So I might provide that. So I think it'd be better if they were assessed in a different way. I would then ask the students to think of a response. So the responses here could be quite varied. One student might say, what do you mean by a different way? Another student might say, absolutely. And then I might kind of, or say, I agree. And then I might ask them, say, in what way do you agree? And draw out from the students, the individual students again, what they would add to this argument, what they are trying to explain themselves. So what you see is through the task, we have individual response, individual language. We deal with it within the task, and we use it afterwards. But in this plenary session, we then make it available to everybody. But then within this plenary, there may be actual individual moments as well, where we deal with individual students, kind of teacher to student, which is public, so it's available to everybody again, but again, dealing with particular students. What I would say is that essentially this same principle can be applied to any speaking that you do in the class. So obviously in our course, as in many courses, you'll have warmers, you'll have personalized speaking after the reading, responses to reading, personalized situations again, you know, with vocabulary. So for example, here, how often do you eat out? Where do you usually go? Have you ever experienced bad service? I think these are from a warmer activity when we're talking about eating out and restaurants. Do you ever go anywhere that's often packed? Can you think of at least 2 places you could recommend? These are both drawing attention and practicing some language which has been taught in the vocabulary, so it's personalizing it. The bad service, I think, may have been also there. Choose 5 words or describe where you live. Again, this is kind of personalizing some of the language they've used. And then these last 2 are responses to reading text. So what I would say is in all of these, you'll be getting quite varied and individual responses. And so the same things that we've just done with those final speaking tasks, we can do with these speaking to. The other thing I just draw attention to is a certain amount of individualizing within the questions that we ask. So, you know, asking things like how often do you, have you ever, and the why. These words, giving at least two. So setting a kind of minimum requirement for weaker students, but kind of encouraging more responses from better students. Giving students a bit of choice about the words or phrases they use. Asking, do you know any, rather than always have you ever. I mean, this is quite interesting because it allows the students to talk, yes, about themselves if they want to. Do you know anyone? Do you know anywhere? Do you know anything? But it also allows them to talk about things they've seen on TV or friends of theirs or things in the newspaper. There's a bit of variety there that they can answer. So you're kind of not cutting off the responses that all students can give within the class. It's a small thing to note, but I think it's just something worth thinking about when you're writing your own questions, when you're trying to personalize language or personalize responses to texts that you bring into the class. Okay, what I want to do is just then look a little bit further into vocabulary tasks and how we can individualize vocabulary in the tasks that we do. If you have a look on the right here briefly, we've got an example of the vocabulary task, which works towards a goal where students talk about their personal experiences of a night out, okay, or staying up late, I think it is actually. So it's a little bit broader, rather than just saying, you know, going out for the night. It's actually just staying up late, which actually allows for a variety of responses. So we have some which is to do with watching TV till late, you know, going away with a client, work, missing a last train home, these kinds of things. So there's kind of quite a variety of possibilities. What you see at the end here are some questions which kind of check the meaning of the words. So 3 things you can stay up really late doing. So in order to answer this, students need to understand stay up really late. Okay. They also see a pattern. So stay up late studying, stay up late, you know, dancing, perhaps. But it's also generating other language, generating other grammar and patterns. Okay. Now, this is what I describe as these divergent concept questions. And the point is that, you know, again, some students will have particular responses either based on their own cultural experience or based on their abilities to speak in English. So basically, when the students respond, some students may not have the language to answer, you know, the answer they want to give, and they might ask you for a translation, or they might look it up in a dictionary. So you're kind of judging how well the students know the word and how well they can use it. And here are some other examples of these kinds of questions. So they're all based on the idea of what you might do. So they're based not on experience, but on a concept of how language works and how vocabulary works. So we might ask, what might you do if there's a fire alarm? Okay. The responses will be, leave the building, get up straight away. But equally and amusingly, sometimes students will be panic, scream, stampede. You know, they may try to use this kind of language. Okay, and interesting, that language also may appear in the text and the listening that they, or conversations they might hear around the, a fire alarm, should they ever experience that. What might happen if you miss a dental appointment? Okay, for example, I'm choosing fairly random words here, but again, we to understand dental appointment, we're checking that, but then we're also understanding how the language which may go out. Your teeth might fall out, your teeth might rot, you might get toothache. There could variety might be removed from the dentist register. There's quite a variety of possible answers there. Some of which might not be, I might not expect, and are dependent on these individuals within the class. Now, how you go through these answers, I mean, usually I actually ask some of these questions as I'm going through the answers to the questions here, to the gap fill. One way we can kind of also individualize that process is as we go through. So we go, right, we're going to check the answers now. So, Julia, give me an answer. So what we do is, rather than going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we start by nominating a person, okay, within the class, an individual, but we give them some choice about what they want to answer. So basically a question which they are confident about would be the ones they would choose, I would imagine. And then we might ask them this follow-up question, see how well they cope with that. And we might then, when they give their answer, what might you do if, for example, they give one answer? Was there anybody else? And just ask the plenary group again, any other ideas, and people just shout out their different answers. Similarly, when we've finished the task, we could ask the students to look back and make some choices about what they want to learn. So, usually there's like 12 to 15 words or phrases within these vocabulary sections. We could just ask the students to prioritize. We could first ask them, did you know any of these before? Sometimes I ask students to mark them 1, 2, 3 as to how well they know the word. And then, focus on what they want to do with it. Or we could just say, right, choose the 8 words or phrases that you want to remember for tomorrow, okay, which you think are most useful for you now. We just kind of controlling and getting students to think about their own learning in that way, in an individual way. Similarly, at the end of this, we've actually just had it cut off a little bit here, but there's usually a little icon which refers the students either to the mobile app, where they can have further practice of the vocabulary in this section, or to the vocab bank, which exists for each unit in the book. And what happens is, at the back in this vocabulary, there is additional vocab work connected either with a topic. In this case, it's topic 1 to do with moving house, which is in the main unit. And we developed that idea of talking about areas and homes, or about a kind of more, if you like, grammatical area of vocabulary. In this case, phrasal verbs, but it could be word building or something like that. Okay. Again, we could ask the students which they prefer to do as part of their homework, and I'll come back to that as an idea in a moment. Okay. So that's basically the end of my ideas for the moment of individualizing in the classroom. Perhaps you'd just like to note down which idea you like best so far, reflect upon that, and perhaps try to employ it in your teaching next time. I hope you feel you can do, whether you're using Roadmap or not. What I want to do now, though, is to look a little bit more at how we can differentiate outside the classroom. Now, I have a kind of curious story incident recently with my son. He's studying, he's 18 now, and he's studying for exams which will lead to university. He's studying maths and physics, and what he does is he often uses YouTube to revise areas of maths or physics, because there's lots of little tutorials on YouTube. It's a great resource. The trouble is, on his account, he also has down the right-hand column, of which we're probably all familiar, a series of, music videos, funny stories with cats, all kinds of other possibilities, the excerpts, best excerpts from Game of Thrones. And it's very easy to get distracted by these. We click on them, and then that leads us down a rabbit hole of various other kind of distractions on YouTube and videos. So he realized he was getting distracted with this. So what he did was he opened a new account, which is the one he only uses for revising. So as a result, he still has this kind of distraction down the side, but the distraction are all other maths tutorials, other areas of physics, other types of connected stuff with science. And he does get distracted with those occasionally. He does click on those. But what I think we could say is these are positive distractions, in that they're maybe helping him, while not necessarily to pass his particular exam he's doing now, they are perhaps helping him think in a more generally mathematical way, or generally developing his ideas of physics. And in fact, they may also help him when he studies, he wants to do engineering, but at university, and these kind of more advanced maths and physics things may well come up then again when he's studying at university, and he will have been primed to deal with those in the first instance. So there is some actual evidence that good language learners are distracted in similar ways. For example, when they look up words in a dictionary. So they'll look up the word that they want to find out in the dictionary, but they will also notice other words or other phrases, either if they're using a paper dictionary around that word, or in the examples they get, if they're using a bilingual dictionary, they might see other examples and think about how those words are used, or return to the English and check to see how that English word is used and its translation. There are various ways that we could develop in that way. So I want to my idea is that perhaps we could encourage this kind of positive distraction. So one thing is, obviously within Roadmap itself, there are other sources. So for example, in the workbook, we could set a workbook task, but the students equally could get distracted by other exercises in the workbook, and we might kind of encourage that in some way. Similarly, the app and My English Lab, they're practicing these particular vocab sets or grammar, but perhaps they could, encourage them to think about, they might move on to another area of vocab, perhaps one which they haven't learned yet, which you may kind of worry about. But as I say, no language is learned in the first instance. So in a way, you should see this as a positive thing, that the students may then be primed when you come to teach it in the classroom, that they may have, looked at it on the app or my English Lab or whatever. What these are limited. They're not quite exactly the same as these distractions that we saw on YouTube. So another way we might encourage them is perhaps using a bilingual dictionary. You know, we could ask them to create collocational word lists. So we take the keywords that we've been teaching in the unit, and we ask them to create collocations to go with those word lists. What will happen, perhaps using the Longman dictionary that often has an examples of collocations with words, that will be the way they get distracted and move on to other things. Another thing I've done is diaries in the classroom. So I asked the students to keep a diary. They were in the UK. I asked them to reflect on what they did in English each day outside of the classroom, things they learned, things they wanted to learn more about. And I asked them to hand that in. I then replied to it. What was interesting was, while some students stuck to that kind of format, for others, they actually developed into something completely different, which was talking about just their day-to-day life and things they'd been reading, all kinds of different stuff, which again, I just kind of responded to with questions. I didn't correct as such. I just saw it as encouraging this general use of English and general interest in English. Again, you could formalize that by asking students to bring in a text or a video in English, or to talk about something they've read, which could be in their own language, which they found interesting, and come into class and you set aside a kind of show and tell 10 minutes where the students talk about what they read, tell them another student, which then might, if you like, distract that other student to find out more, and etc. etc. You get the idea. There's a kind of slightly more random general interest to follow their own interests in English and beyond English. Now, what I should say is we should have a kind of dose of reality about this. When I did this in class, I had a group of about 16 students. Probably, I think 6, 7, 8 maybe did it in the first instance, but regular people, there was only 3, about 20% of the class. Now, we could just accept that and just let the students get on with it, which I think is fine personally. But the reality is, if we want all our students to do it in this way and to develop their own individual interests, then I'm afraid the only way to do that is through assessment. And so what we might kind of consider is, rather than just having assessment on the marks they get in the test or the achievement they have in particular tests that we give or homework, that what we could do is to actually change our kind of assessment to encourage learning in a way. So what I would be looking at here is maybe a participatory grade. So rather, maybe we tell the students, right, you will get this percentage of your mark will be given if you complete 10 assignments over this term. We may set more than that. So we give a certain amount of choice to the students about which assignment they think is more interesting to them or more productive for them. But the grade is given on completing a certain number. You get a lower grade if you complete fewer. Similarly, I saw a conference talk about assessment for learning, and they'd got the students to first find out what their vocabulary knowledge was already. So they accessed various different measures of vocabulary knowledge. Then they discussed what it was to know a word, and then they basically set goals for themselves of how many words or phrases and what they should know about these words for the term. And the test was basically based on this kind of these goals. They filled in a kind of portfolio, I think, And that certainly is a way we could develop testing where we have portfolios of maybe assignments which we set or tests that we give, but also these kind of individualized kind of word lists or text that the students read or things that they do in English, and that we devise criteria which reflect these kinds of portfolios. What I would say there is we want the students involved in setting this criteria. The criteria need to be clear to the students of what they will fulfill, and that will help them progress, I think, in terms of their learning. It's not just in terms of assessment for performance. Okay, that is my end. We've got 10 minutes left.